The burning house. It was a house deep in a quiet neighborhood, where narrow streets and rows of old trees created a distinctive peacefulness. But that house, unlike any other, carried a story that no one in the neighborhood could forget. 3 years ago, on a cold winter night, the house caught fire. The fierce fire engulfed everything, from the ancient roof to the oak walls that had stood for decades. People said it was an accident, a candle left in the living room. But rumors painted a completely different picture. John and Emily, the young couple who lived in the house, did not make it out in time. They died in the fire, leaving the whole neighborhood in grief and fear. After the fire, only the skeleton of the house remained, charred and abandoned. But the story does not end there. A year later, neighbors began to hear strange sounds coming from the house. At first, it was just a soft moaning sound like the wind blowing through broken windows. But then, the noises became more distinct. Footsteps echoed in the dark, a woman's soft laughter, and even a muffled cry. Nathan, a curious and daring young man, decided to explore the house on a moonlit night. Nathan's friends tried to stop him, but he just laughed and said, "We're grown up now, we don't need to be afraid of wild stories anymore." He took a flashlight and entered the house, a place no one dared to go. Inside, the air was cold and the smell of burning smoke still lingered. The light from Nathan's flashlight swept across the charred walls and burned objects, creating strange shadows. He walked deeper into the house, step by step, until he reached the living room, the place where the fire was believed to be at its center. And then he heard it. At first it was just a soft sound, like a mouse scurrying across a wooden floor. But then it got louder, footsteps, clear and determined, coming toward him. Nathan stood still, trying to control his breathing, but his heart was pounding like it was trying to escape his chest. "Is anyone there?" he said, his voice shaking. No one answered. But the footsteps kept coming. Nathan's flashlight shone into a dark corner of the room, where a half-burned armchair still stood. Suddenly, the armchair began to sway, as if someone had sat down. Nathan stepped back, his hands shaking so much he almost dropped the flashlight. "Go away," a voice whispered, clear and cold. Nathan screamed, turned, and ran from the house. But as he reached the door, the rotten wooden door suddenly slammed shut in his face, as if controlled by an invisible hand. He panicked, pounding on the door frantically, until finally the door swung open and he fell out. From that night on, Nathan never dared to go near the burning house again. But the noises continued. Neighbors began to see shadowy figures in the house at night. Some even claimed to hear voices calling their names as they passed by. No one knows what really happened that night the house burned down. But one thing is for sure, the story of that house is not a myth. And if you dare, try to step inside. But be careful, you might never get out. Backhand index pointing right. What do you think about this story? If you feel creepy, share it now so your friends can feel it too. Don't forget to like and follow so you don't miss the next exciting stories. Story 2. The Strange Knock. Jake is an ordinary office worker living in the suburbs. After a tiring day at work, he returns to his small apartment to enjoy the peace. It is a cold winter night, the snow covers the road and the wind blows through the bare trees. Jake turns on the heater, makes a cup of hot coffee, and sits down on the sofa to watch his favorite movie. Everything is quiet when suddenly, there is a knock on the door. Jake is startled, puts down his coffee cup and looks towards the door. The clock on the wall reads 11 p.m. No one would come to visit at this hour. He stands up, approaches the door and listens. Knock, knock. The knock comes again, this time louder and more urgent. Jake hesitates, but finally opens the door. There is no one outside. He looks around, only seeing a deserted street, the dim light of the street lamps illuminating the thick snow. A cold wind blew, making Jake shiver. He closed the door, telling himself that the wind must have made the noise. But as soon as he turned away, the knocking came again, louder this time. Knock, knock, knock. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. He rushed to the door, threw it open, but again, no one was there. Who's playing? He shouted, his voice full of anger and tension. But there was only silence. Jake closed the door and bolted it. He tried to ignore it, returning to the couch to turn on the movie. But unease crept into his mind. The knocking stopped, but the air in the house felt strangely heavy and cold. The clock struck midnight. Jake stood up, deciding to go to sleep to forget what had happened. He walked into the bedroom, turned off the light, and lay down on the bed. But as soon as he closed his eyes, the knocking came again, not on the front door, but on his bedroom door. Jake jumped up, his heart stopping. Someone was knocking on his bedroom door from inside his apartment. He gathered his courage and walked slowly toward the door. Knock, knock. The knocking continued, steady and haunting. Jake grasped the doorknob, feeling his hands shaking. He took a deep breath and opened the door. No one was there. The living room was dark, save for the dim light from the TV, which was flickering with images. But something had changed. The fireplace, which had been blazing, was now off. A chill filled the room. Jake felt as if someone was watching him. And then, he saw it. On the glass door leading to the balcony, a hand was clearly imprinted in the thin layer of snow. But how could that be? His balcony was on the third floor, unreachable by anyone. Jake stepped back, his eyes glued to the strange handprint. Knock, knock, knock. The knocking came again, this time from the balcony window itself. Jake stood still, unable to move, as if his body had been frozen with fear. A shadow loomed behind the glass, faint but distinctly human. Jake, a whisper rang out, soft but haunting. Jake couldn't take it anymore. He screamed, stormed out of the apartment, and ran down the stairs, never looking back. The next day, Jake called his best friend, Ryan, to come check out the apartment. Ryan came, but found nothing unusual. No handprints on the glass, no knocking. But as Ryan left, he told Jake something that made him shiver. Your bedroom door has 3 long scratches, like someone scratched it. Jake never lived in the apartment again. But later tenants told similar stories, strange knocking sounds, handprints on the glass, and whispers calling their names in the night. Story 3. The Haunted Forest. When the Blackwood Forest is mentioned, everyone in the small town shakes their heads and changes the subject immediately. Blackwood is not an ordinary forest, it is a place where mysterious stories are passed down through generations, each time getting a little more creepy. The forest is located about 15 miles from the town, with ancient oak trees towering, the foliage so dense that sunlight can hardly penetrate. But what makes Blackwood scary is not its gloomy appearance, but the strange phenomena that take place inside it. The story begins with a group of young people including Ethan, Chloe, Jack, and Mia. As people who love to explore and do not believe in rumors, they decide to break the curse of the forest by camping there for a night. With backpacks full of food, tents, and flashlights, they excitedly enter Blackwood, not knowing that this will be an experience that will change their lives forever. At first, everything seemed fine. The sun was shining gently, the birds were chirping, and the fresh air of the forest was soothing. But as the night wore on, things began to change. The campfire crackled as the group sat around telling jokes. Jack, always the funniest of the bunch, began to tease the rumors. "What do we have to be afraid of? Ghosts? At most, I'll buy them coffee." Jack laughed, but his laughter was cut short by a strange sound. Crack! The sound of a branch snapping echoed from deep in the forest. Ethan grabbed his flashlight and shined it toward the source of the sound, but saw nothing but darkness. "It must be an animal," Mia said, trying to reassure them, but her voice was laced with worry. Just then, a cold wind blew through, causing the campfire to sway. Chloe shivered, pulling her jacket closer to her body. But the wind carried something else, a whisper. "Do you hear that?" Chloe asked, her eyes wide with fear. The group fell silent, listening more closely. And then they heard it, the distant whisper, coming from nowhere, but enough to make their skin crawl. "Go away." The voice was small but clear, ringing in the air. Ethan jumped up, shining his flashlight around. "Who's there?" "Stop fooling around," he shouted, but no one answered. Things got even stranger when the campfire suddenly went out, as if snuffed out by an invisible hand. Darkness enveloped the group, and the whispering now seemed to be everywhere. "We have to get out of here," Mia said, her voice trembling. But before they could gather their things, a laugh rang out, not a happy laugh, but a malicious, long, cold laugh. The group ran through the forest in a panic, but it seemed to be changing. The paths they had taken during the day were gone, replaced by unfamiliar paths that led them deeper into the darkness. Chloe screamed as she saw a figure pass by, tall, with eyes that burned like two flames. But when Ethan turned to look, the figure was gone. Jack, who had always said he didn't believe in ghosts, was shaking. "What the hell is going on here?" he shouted, but no one had an answer. The group finally reached a clearing in the forest, where a giant tree with a trunk carved with strange symbols stood. On the ground, they saw strange tracks, like human footprints, but long and sharp like claws. "We shouldn't be here," Mia whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Look!" Chloe shouted, pointing into the darkness. A group of dark figures began to appear, moving slowly but surely toward them. No one knew what they were, not quite human, not quite animal. The creatures had no faces, but each step they took made the air around them tense. Ethan pulled the group away, but the creatures grew closer. They surrounded them, their whispers blending together, forming a creepy sound. "You'll never get out." The next day, a search party was sent into the forest after receiving reports of the group's disappearance. They found belongings, tents, and a dead campfire, but no trace of Ethan, Chloe, Jack, or Mia. On the trunk of an ancient tree in the center of the forest, they discovered something strange, 4 names carved in claws, along with a scrawled line. "Never come back." Blackwood Forest grew more famous from then on, but no one dared to enter. Tales of whispers, mysterious shadows, and lost souls continued to haunt the town. Story 4. The Witch's Curse. The small, peaceful town of Ravenwood lies deep in the valley. But when night falls, it hides terrifying tales of a dark past. The townspeople avoid mentioning the name of Eliza Thorne, a woman who was convicted of being a witch and burned at the stake hundreds of years ago. Before her death, Eliza swore to return to take revenge on those who had wronged her. Her curse was forgotten by time, until strange events began to occur. Amy is a young girl who has just moved to Ravenwood to become a teacher. She loves the peace of the small town, with its old wooden houses and fresh air. But after only a few weeks of living here, Amy begins to hear strange stories from her students about the witch Eliza. "You have to be careful, Amy," Michael, a smart but shy student, says during recess. "She's still here. If you see her in your dreams, it's too late." Amy smiled, trying to ease Michael's fears. "They're just stories, Michael. There are no witches." But that night, Amy began to feel something was wrong. As she read in her old rented house, the wind blew through the windows, carrying a whisper she couldn't understand. "They're going to pay." Amy shivered, telling herself it was just her imagination. But when she entered her bedroom, she noticed something strange. The mirror in her room was covered in a thin layer of dust, and on it, there were long handprints as if someone had just touched it. "I must have forgotten to clean the mirror," Amy told herself, but the uneasiness began to creep in. The strange phenomena continued. One morning, Amy discovers tiny footprints leading from the front door to the middle of the living room, even though she is sure she locked the door before going to bed. Another night, she hears soft laughter coming from the kitchen, but when she turns on the light, no one is there. Things come to a head when Amy begins to dream of a strange woman. The woman has long, messy hair, eyes as black as the abyss, and a cold smile. In the dream, she stands next to Amy, whispering, "They killed me, but I am still here. You will be the one to help me complete the curse." Amy wakes up in a panic, cold sweat pouring down her forehead. She decides to find out the truth about Eliza Thorne. Amy goes to the town library, where she finds an old book about the history of Ravenwood. According to the book, Eliza Thorne was a solitary woman who lived in the woods and often helped people with folk remedies. But when a series of mysterious deaths occurred in the town, she was accused of being a witch. They captured Eliza, tortured her into confessing, and burned her alive in the town square. Before she died, Eliza cursed everyone who had contributed to her death, as well as their descendants. Amy felt a chill as she read the last paragraph. The curse will last forever, until another soul takes her place. That night, as Amy slept, the dream came again. But this time, it was not just a dream. She woke to find her house strangely cold. All the windows were wide open, and in the dim light of the street lamp, she saw a dark figure standing in the corner. "You cannot escape your fate," Eliza's voice rang out, cold and full of hatred. Amy screamed, dashing out of the house and running straight to the town church, where she knew she would be safest. The priest was there, heard her story, and agreed to help. "Come with me," he said, leading Amy to the hill where Eliza had been executed. There, they found an old, barren oak tree, standing tall in the darkness. The priest began to recite prayers, while Amy clearly felt an invisible force trying to stop them. The wind howled, the ground shook beneath their feet, and Eliza's voice filled the air. "You cannot break the curse. I will return, no matter how hard you try." The priest placed his hand on Amy's shoulder, whispering, "Trust. This is the only way." Amy closed her eyes, gathering all her mental strength to fight off her fear. When the priest finished reciting the last prayer, the old oak tree let out a loud crack, then broke in two. Everything suddenly went silent. Eliza was gone. Amy left Ravenwood the next day, with the lesson that not all fairy tales are myths. But deep down, she knew that Eliza's curse might have been sealed, but her hatred was still lurking somewhere, waiting for an opportunity to resurface. Story 5. The Night Watchman. Alex is a young man who has just taken a job as a night guard at an old office building in the city center. The job seems simple: just patrol the floors, check the security cameras, and make sure everything is okay. To Alex, it is a great opportunity to earn money without having to do too much work. But what he does not know is that this job also hides a terrible secret. From the first day, Alex feels something strange. The air in the building has an inexplicable coldness, even though the heating system is still working normally. The light from the fluorescent lights on the ceiling is dim, flickering from time to time, making the long hallway seem to stretch on forever. In the security room, Alex looks through the building's records. One thing that catches his attention is an old photo from the 1970s, showing a group of guards standing in front of the building. In the center of the photo was a tall man, neatly dressed in a uniform with a stern face. His name was noted below: James Harlow, head of security. "That guy looks familiar," Alex muttered, but quickly dismissed the thought. The first night passed quietly, without any unusual events. But on the second night, things started to get strange. It was almost 2 a.m., and Alex was sitting in the security room looking through the cameras when suddenly, one of the monitors displaying the images from the third floor lost signal. "Shit, it's broken again," he muttered, grabbing his flashlight and going upstairs to check. The third floor hallway was dark, with only a faint light coming from the window at the end of the hall. Alex walked slowly, his flashlight beam scanning every corner. But he saw nothing unusual until he heard footsteps echoing behind him. He turned around, but there was no one. "Is anyone here?" Alex spoke, his voice echoing in the empty space. No answer. Alex decided to return to the security room. But as soon as he entered, the camera screen automatically turned on, showing an image that made him shiver. On the screen on the third floor, the one he had just passed, appeared a figure standing still, his back to the camera. "What the hell?" Alex whispered, not taking his eyes off the screen. The person slowly turned his head. His face was pale, his dark eyes staring into the lens, as if he knew Alex was watching. On the third night, Alex began to hear strange sounds throughout the building: doors opening and closing, footsteps rushing up the stairs, and even a low laugh echoing in the hallway. He told the manager about this, but only received a simple answer: "Don't worry, you'll get used to it." Old buildings often have strange sounds. But Alex knew it was more than just strange noises. On the fourth night, things came to a head. While Alex was on patrol, he saw a figure standing at the end of the fourth floor hallway. It was a tall man, wearing an old security guard uniform, with a tilted hat and a blank look in his eyes. Alex felt his legs freeze, but he forced himself to speak. "Who is it? What are you doing here?" The man didn't answer. Instead, he walked slowly toward Alex. "Don't come any closer," Alex shouted, but the man continued to advance, his eyes filled with hatred. Alex backed away, but his foot tripped over a chair and he fell to the floor. When he looked up, the man was gone. The next morning, Alex decided to find out the truth. He looked up information about James Harlow, the guard in the old photo. He discovered a horrifying truth: James Harlow had died in this very building 40 years ago. He was murdered while on duty, and the killer was never caught. Rumor has it that James's spirit can't rest in peace. He continues to patrol the building every night, protecting it, but sometimes he targets night shift workers like Alex, as if they were the ones who killed him. Alex decides to quit his job immediately. But before he leaves, he looks back at the old photo hanging on the wall of the security room one last time. And in that moment, he feels a chill down his spine. the photo is no longer the same. Next to James Harlow, there is now another figure, a young man with a face exactly like Alex, looking straight at him with a mysterious smile. Story 6. The Glowing Eyes. Shadow Lane is a dark alley deep in the city. During the day, it is just an ordinary alley, where old cars are parked against the walls and sunlight rarely reaches the ground. But at night, Shadow Lane takes on a creepy look, as if it has a life of its own. People around say that every time they pass through this alley at night, they feel like someone is watching them. But the scariest thing is the eyes, a pair of strange glowing eyes, always present in the darkness. Emma is a waitress at a nearby coffee shop. Every night after her shift, she often walks through Shadow Lane to go home, because it is the shortest way. The rumors about the glowing eyes do not bother her. Just stories to scare children, she tells herself. But one night, Emma discovers that those rumors are more than just lies. It was a cold night, the wind blowing hard, rattling the old signs. Emma stepped into the alley, her thick coat wrapped tightly around her. Shadow Lane was darker than usual, the street lights flickering weakly, as if they were about to go out. She walked faster, her shoes echoing in the quiet. But then she noticed something unusual, another set of footsteps, matching her own. Emma stopped. The footsteps stopped too. She turned to look, but saw no one. There was only darkness behind her. Imagination, she told herself, trying to calm herself, and continued walking. But then she saw them, two bright red lights flashing from the end of the alley. She froze, her eyes glued to the lights. They weren't lights or reflections of anything else. They were eyes staring at her, unblinking, unwavering. Emma took a deep breath, stepping back, trying to escape the sight of those eyes. But they seemed to be getting closer. She could feel a cold air creeping through the air, as if the darkness were coming to life and closing in around her. Emma turned and ran, but the eyes followed. Footsteps echoed behind her, fast, heavy, as if something huge was chasing her. She didn't dare look back, only knowing that she had to get out of this alley. By the time she was out of Shadow Lane, Emma was nearly collapsing from exhaustion. She turned back, but the glowing eyes were gone. The alley now looked peaceful and quiet, as if nothing had happened. Emma told her colleagues and friends about this, but no one believed her. "You're overworking yourself," they said. But Emma knew that what she saw was real. Emma avoided the alley for the next few nights. But one day, she was late for work and in a hurry to get home, so she had to pass through Shadow Lane again. She stepped into the alley, her heart pounding in her chest. Everything was as dark as before, but this time, she felt a presence more clearly. And then, those eyes appeared again. This time, they were closer, brighter, and threatening. But it wasn't just the eyes, a shadowy figure appeared behind the red light. It wasn't human, nor was it an animal. It was tall and misshapen, as if it didn't belong to this world. Emma couldn't run, her legs were frozen in place. A low growl rang out, making her shiver. "You saw me." A voice rang out, deep and dark. Emma screamed, her whole body shaking. But just as she thought it was over, a bright light came from somewhere. The headlights of a large truck rushed into the alley, breaking the darkness. When Emma opened her eyes, the glowing eyes and the strange figure were gone. Emma left the city the next day, vowing never to return to Shadow Lane. But the people who lived nearby still said that the glowing eyes still appeared in the darkness, always watching anyone who dared to enter the alley after nightfall. Story 7. The Sound of Iron Chains. The house number 13 at the end of Willowwood Street has been abandoned for more than 50 years. The whitewashed walls are peeling, the roof is full of holes, and the windows are always closed. But what scares people is not its appearance, but the sounds coming from inside, the clanging of iron chains, echoing every night. No one knows exactly why the house was abandoned. Some say that the house's former owner, Mr. Richard Harrow, mysteriously disappeared. Others say that he was murdered, and his spirit is still trapped in the house, dragging the long iron chains like a never-ending curse. Hannah, a curious young girl, has just moved to this neighborhood with her boyfriend Lucas. From the first time she saw house number 13, she was attracted by its mysterious appearance. Despite the neighbors' warnings, Hannah does not believe in ghost stories. "An abandoned house can't do anything to me," she laughed as Lucas tried to stop her from exploring the house. One night, Hannah decided to sneak into the house with Lucas. They both brought flashlights and phones to record their exploration, not knowing that what they were about to encounter would change everything. As soon as they stepped through the rusty iron gate, Hannah felt a cold breeze surround them. The moon was hidden by thick clouds, dimming the light from their flashlights. The front door creaked open when Lucas pushed it gently. The two entered the house, where everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, and the smell of mold filled the air. "Hannah, we shouldn't stay here long," Lucas said, his voice trembling slightly. "Just a little while," Hannah replied, her eyes shining with excitement. They passed through the living room, where an old armchair stood alone in the middle of the room. Suddenly, from somewhere on the second floor, a sound rang out. Clang, clang. Hannah paused, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. "Hear that?" she whispered. Lucas nodded, his face pale. "Let's go. This isn't a joke." But Hannah, driven by curiosity, decided to go up to the second floor. Lucas reluctantly followed, not wanting to leave her alone. The stairs creaked under each step, as if they were about to break at any moment. When they reached the second floor hallway, the sound of the chains rang out again, closer this time. Clang, clang. The sound seemed to come from the end of the hallway, where a door to a room was ajar. "Hannah, don't," Lucas grabbed her hand, but she pulled it away and moved closer. She pushed the door open, and the flashlight beam illuminated an empty room, with only a wooden chair in the middle of the room. But what stunned them both was a long, old, rusty iron chain on the chair. Suddenly, the door behind them slammed shut. "What?" Hannah screamed, rushing towards the door, trying to open it, but it seemed to be locked from the outside. The sound of the iron chain rang out again, this time inside the room. They both turned and saw it, a shadowy figure, holding an iron chain, approaching. Lucas pulled Hannah, both of them banging on the door, screaming for help. But no one heard. "You shouldn't have come here," a deep, hoarse voice rang out. The figure grew clearer, a tall man, his face distorted, with red eyes glowing in the darkness. The chain on his hand made a clanging sound every time he walked. "You have disturbed my peace," he said, his voice full of hatred. Hannah and Lucas finally managed to open the door, dash out of the room, and run down the stairs. But the house seemed to have turned into a maze, with endless hallways and disappearing stairs. The sound of chains echoed everywhere, as if they were being surrounded. "We're not getting out," Lucas shouted, his eyes filled with fear. "We have to try," Hannah shouted back, pulling him forward. Finally, they rushed through another door and suddenly found themselves standing outside. The house had vanished behind them, as if it had never existed. Hannah and Lucas never returned to number 13. But every time they passed by it, they could still feel eyes watching them from the shadows. Neighborhood residents said that the sound of chains still rang out every night, and if you dared to enter the house, you might encounter the spirit of Richard Harrow, who protected the house's peace at all costs. Story 8. Stormy Night. The small town of Crestwood sits at the foot of a mountain, where everyone knows each other. One night, when the sky is torn apart by lightning and the rain pours down, a mysterious story begins. It is not a normal stormy night, it brings things that no one can explain. The story begins with the Parker family. Rebecca and her husband, Michael, live with their 8-year-old son, Ethan, in a cozy cabin on the edge of town. That night, when the storm begins to roll in, the family gathers in the living room, sitting by the fireplace to escape the damp chill outside. Ethan, with the curiosity of a child, looks out the window. "Mommy, do storms bring strange things?" he asks. Rebecca smiles, stroking her son's head. "No, honey. It's just thunder and wind." But Ethan isn't sure. He pointed out the window. "I just saw someone out there." Michael put down his coffee, frowning. "It's the woods out there, Ethan. It's probably just the shadows." Ethan shook his head, his voice firmer. "No. It's someone. They're looking at us." Michael decided to check to reassure Ethan. He put on his raincoat, grabbed his flashlight, and stepped out onto the porch. The wind howled through the trees, thunder rumbling through the sky. He shined the flashlight into the darkness, but saw nothing but a thick sheet of rain. When Michael returned, he found Rebecca standing in the doorway, her eyes filled with concern. "Is there anything?" "No, there's no one," Michael said, but deep down he felt uneasy. Something about this storm was making him uneasy. As the night grew darker, the storm grew more intense. Rebecca and Michael decided to put Ethan to bed, but as soon as they turned off the lights and lay down, strange noises began. Knock, knock. A soft knock sounded on the door, steady and cold. Michael sat up, looking at Rebecca. "Did you hear that?" She nodded, her eyes frightened. "There's someone outside." Michael grabbed a flashlight and went to investigate. When he opened the door, wind and rain were pounding in, but no one was standing there. The porch floor was soaked, but there were no footprints. He closed the door, but the knocking came again, louder this time, as if someone were knocking right inside the house. "Where's Ethan?" Rebecca yelled, rushing into her son's bedroom. The bed was empty. The sheets were askew, as if Ethan had left in a hurry. They found Ethan standing in the living room, facing the large window. He stood still as a statue, staring out. "Ethan!" Rebecca called out, running to hug her son. "What are you doing here?" "She wants to come in," Ethan said, his voice flat but his eyes empty. Michael and Rebecca followed his gaze. Outside the window, they saw the shadowy figure of a woman. She stood motionless in the rain, her long hair hanging limply and her white dress clinging to her body. Her eyes were glowing, staring straight at them, piercing their souls. Michael slammed the curtain shut. "It can't be. We're hallucinating." "She said we took something from her," Ethan whispered, his voice controlled. Rebecca clutched her son's hand, trembling. "We didn't take anything." "Michael, what's going on?" The strange events continued. The lights in the house flickered on and off. The sound of the wind outside now sounded like the screams of someone in pain. Every time they looked out the window, the woman got closer, as if drifting through the rain. Michael tried to calm himself. He found an old book in the closet, telling the history of the town of Crestwood. and that's when he discovered the horrifying truth. Over a century ago, a woman named Eleanor lived on the edge of town. Accused of being a witch, Eleanor was driven out of the village one stormy night. She died tragically in the nearby woods, and her curse was, every stormy night, her spirit would return to seek justice. She thinks we have something to do with it? Rebecca asked in panic. Michael shook his head. We're just the latest victims. Eleanor's silhouette was now standing right outside the front door. The knocking grew louder, as if it were about to break down. We have to do something, Rebecca shouted. Michael remembered a detail from the book. Eleanor just wanted to be left in peace. A piece of land in the woods needed to be returned to her. Michael and Rebecca had no choice. They led Ethan out of the house, into the rain, and straight into the woods. With each step, Eleanor's breathing echoed behind her, as if she were following. They came to a large tree, where Michael hastily dug a small hole and placed the book down, as a symbolic atonement. He whispered, "We won't hurt you. Leave us alone." A strong wind blew, and Eleanor's screams echoed through the woods. Then all was quiet. The rain stopped, and the sky began to brighten. The Parkers returned home, but they never forgot that stormy night. The house seemed to return to normal, but Rebecca always felt as if there were eyes watching them from the darkness. Story 9. The Black Scarf. The legend of the Black Scarf has existed in the small village of Rivermist for centuries. It is said that on moonless nights, on the road leading across the moors, a spirit with a long black scarf wrapped around its body appears, watching over those who dare to pass. Some lucky ones only feel a chill and are spared, but the unlucky ones never return. Ethan and his friend Rachel do not believe in this legend. The two young people, eager for a scary experience, decide to drive down Rivermist Road on a dark night. "We won't see anything," Ethan said, his laughter mingling with the sound of the car engine. "It's just a story to scare children." Rachel shrugged, but inside she was a little worried. The darkness outside was as thick as a curtain, only the light of their headlights penetrated a short distance. The road wound through the deserted fields, the grass swaying in the wind as if whispering secrets. "Ethan, don't drive too fast," Rachel said, her eyes scanning the road. "This place feels different." Ethan smirked. "Scared? Don't worry, I'll protect you if I see a ghost." As they drove further down the road, the air in the car suddenly turned cold. Rachel pulled her coat closer to her, but the cold didn't seem to be coming from outside. Suddenly, Ethan slammed on the brakes. "What the hell?" Rachel screamed, clutching the seat. Ahead, in the middle of the road, a figure stood motionless. The figure was shrouded in a long black cloak, covering her from head to toe. The headlights made the cloak shimmer, but the face underneath was completely in shadow. "There's someone," Ethan whispered, his eyes never leaving the figure. "Go! Don't stop!" Rachel screamed, panicked. Ethan nodded, pressing the gas, but the car didn't budge. He checked the gear shift, stepped hard on the gas, but the engine just roared and didn't move. "What's going on?" Ethan muttered, slamming his hands on the steering wheel. The figure in the black cloak began to move closer. Each step it took made no sound, but the air around it seemed to freeze, making Rachel feel suffocated. "Ethan, you have to do something," Rachel sobbed. Ethan tried to open the car door, but it didn't budge. The headlights suddenly went out, and complete darkness enveloped them. When the headlights suddenly came back on, the figure in the black cloak was standing right next to Rachel's car door. The face hidden behind the cloak was now revealed, a pale face with sunken, hateful eyes. Rachel screamed, tugging at Ethan's arm. "We have to get out of here." But when she turned around, Ethan was no longer in the driver's seat. Instead, the black cloth was now wrapped tightly around his seat, as if sucking the life out of him. Rachel didn't know where she got the strength. She kicked open the car door, rushed out and ran in the opposite direction. Her footsteps echoed on the deserted road, and behind her, the cold laughter of the figure in the black cloth still echoed. Rachel was found by the villagers the next morning, huddled on the side of the road, her face pale and her eyes panicked. She told what had happened, but no one believed her. Ethan's car was found later, but there was no trace of him. Only the black cloth was lying right on the driver's seat, like a haunting message from that mysterious shadow. Since that night, no one dared to pass River Mist Road after nightfall. Story 10. The Old Mansion. Deep in the dense woods of the suburbs, the old mansion on Greenbrier Hill has been abandoned for more than half a century. With its majestic but crumbling Gothic architecture, it resembles an old giant watching the world through the empty eyes of broken windows. The locals believe that this place is cursed, and the creepy stories about the mansion keep people away. Elena, an archaeology student with a passion for exploring mysterious places, decides to go to Greenbrier Mansion to investigate. She is convinced by her best friend, Mark, that this will be a great opportunity to learn about the mysterious history of this place. "It's just an old house," Mark says, holding his camera. "We'll go in, take some pictures, and get out. There's nothing to be afraid of." Elena agrees, although she is still a little nervous. According to legend, the mansion once belonged to the wealthy Hensley family, but the entire family mysteriously disappeared in 1925. No one has lived here since then. It is said that ghostly cries and laughter still echo in the dark night, along with dark shadows passing by the windows. Elena and Mark arrived at the mansion on a gloomy rainy afternoon. The sky was gray, and thunder and lightning flashed occasionally, making the mansion even more terrifying. They pushed open the rusty iron gate and entered the desolate garden, where weeds grew wildly, blocking the path. "It feels like this place has been waiting for us," Elena whispered, shivering. Mark turned on his flashlight and walked to the large wooden door. The door opened with a long creak, revealing a dark space that smelled of mold and decay. The main hallway of the mansion was large with high ceilings, but everything was covered in dust and cobwebs. A large portrait hung on the wall, depicting a man with cold eyes, staring at them as if watching their every move. "Welcome to the Hensleys," Mark joked, his voice echoing in the empty space. Elena laughed, but her laughter quickly died when she heard a strange sound from upstairs. "Knock, knock, knock. Did you hear anything?" Elena asked, looking up at the stairs. Mark nodded, his gaze tense. "It must be the wind. Let's keep going." They climbed the stairs, each step making the wooden planks creak. Upstairs, they found a series of abandoned rooms, each with its own story. But when they reached the last room, they discovered something unusual. The room was more carefully decorated than the others, with patterned wallpaper and a large bed covered in curtains. But what made Elena shiver was the large mirror in the middle of the room. The mirror was old, but its surface was strangely clean, reflecting their images clearly. Elena moved closer, but when she looked into the mirror, she noticed something strange. Mark's shadow was not in the mirror. "Mark, this isn't normal," Elena whispered, turning to look at her friend. But when she turned back, Mark had disappeared. "Mark? Where are you?" Elena shouted, but only her own echo answered. She grabbed her flashlight and ran around the room, but saw no trace of Mark. When she turned back to look at the mirror, her figure was now standing next to someone else, a woman in a white dress, her face pale and her eyes empty. The woman in the mirror turned her head to look straight at Elena and smiled. Elena screamed, turning and running out of the room. But when she rushed into the hallway, everything had changed. The old walls were now covered in blood, and footsteps echoed from all directions. "She won't let you go," a voice whispered in Elena's ear. Elena didn't know how long she ran, but eventually, she found the exit. She rushed through the wooden door and fell into the garden, gasping for breath. But when she turned back to look at the mansion, she saw Mark standing in the doorway, looking at her with empty eyes, no longer himself. "You'll be back, soon," he said, his voice echoing in the air. The door slammed shut, and the mansion returned to its silent state as if nothing had ever happened. Elena never told anyone about what happened in the Greenbrier mansion. But every night, she heard Mark's voice in her head, calling her back. Story 11. The Ghost Footprints. On a cold winter morning, in the small village of Ravenhill, everything began with a strange discovery. The ground was covered with white snow, and in the quiet space, a series of mysterious footprints appeared, leading from the edge of the forest deep into the dense forest. The first person to see them was Sam, a local hunter. While checking his traps, he stopped when he noticed that the footprints did not belong to any animal he knew. The footprints were larger than human feet, with 3 long and sharp toes, like the claws of a giant creature. Sam followed them for a while, but when the footprints led deeper into the forest, he stopped, feeling the air was colder than usual. It seemed that something in the forest was watching him, something he could not see, but could clearly feel. The story quickly spread throughout the village. A group of young men, Jack, Emily, and Chris, decided to explore the footprints. Despite the warnings of their elders, they packed their gear and headed into the woods that afternoon. "I think it's just some big animal," Jack said, trying to reassure the group. "But Sam said he's never seen anything like it," Emily repeated, her eyes full of concern. Chris, who loved the thrill, just laughed. "Maybe we'll find a monster, and then we'll be famous." They set off, following the mysterious footprints through the winding trails. At first, everything seemed normal. But as the sun set, the atmosphere in the woods became gloomy. The footprints led them to a clearing in the woods. In the middle of the clearing was a large boulder, where the footprints abruptly stopped. "What's going on here?" "It's gone," Jack said, bending down to examine it. Emily shivered, looking around. "I don't like this place. We should go back." But before they could move, a sound came from behind them, a low, menacing growl. "It sounds like something breathing," Chris whispered, his face pale. A pair of glowing eyes appeared from the shadows, staring at them. The group froze, not daring to move. The creature stepped out of the shadows, revealing itself as a tall figure, covered in thick black fur, and with sharp claws that matched the footprints they had just followed. "Run!" Jack shouted, pulling the group back. The 3 of them ran as fast as they could, but the forest seemed to stretch on forever. The heavy footsteps of the creature behind them continued, as if it were toying with them. Emily slipped, and when she turned around, the creature was standing right above her. But instead of attacking, it just crouched down, let out a warning roar, and disappeared into the darkness, leaving her lying on the ground, trembling. The next day, the group returned to the village, recounting what had happened. But when they led the villagers to where the footprints had appeared, they had all disappeared. There was no trace of the mysterious creature or the terrifying journey of the night before. The story of the ghostly footprints became a great mystery in the village. Although no one could explain it, everyone agreed on one thing: the forest was no place for humans. Story 12. The Melancholy Melody. The small village of Elderwood, nestled among the misty hills, is always shrouded in silence. But on moonlit nights, when the wind blows through the old windows, a melancholy melody rings out from the abandoned wooden house at the end of the village. It is said that it is the piano of Evelyn Gray, a talented but short-lived artist. Evelyn used to live in that house, and her music captivated the whole village. But tragedy struck one winter night, when Evelyn was found lying dead next to her piano, her skinny hands resting on the keys as if playing her last piece. Since then, the house has been abandoned, but the piano is still there, and Evelyn's music occasionally rings out, even when no one is sitting in front of it. Rachel, a young girl who loves music, moves to Elderwood to become a teacher. From the first day she heard the story, she was drawn to the abandoned house and the rumor of the haunted harp. A harp that plays by itself? That's just a scare story, Rachel laughed as she listened to the villagers tell it. But Margaret, an elder in the village, warned her, don't underestimate it. If you hear the harp, stay away from that house. Evelyn doesn't want to be disturbed. Rachel didn't believe in ghosts, and her curiosity drove her to find out the truth. One night, when the harp sounded in the silence, Rachel decided to go to the abandoned house. The dim moonlight illuminated the path leading to the house, covering everything in a cold silver. Rachel brought a flashlight and stepped through the old wooden gate. The house stood there, silent, but from inside came melancholy melodies. The music filled the air, so beautiful that it took Rachel's breath away. She stepped inside. Although the house was covered in dust and cobwebs, the piano in the middle of the living room still shined like new. The keys moved, as if an invisible pair of hands were playing. Rachel approached, her eyes never leaving the piano. "Who is there?" she whispered. The piano stopped. The space fell into absolute silence. Suddenly, a whisper rang out right next to her ear, "Don't touch my piano." Rachel turned around, but there was no one. Her heart was pounding, but she couldn't move away. The melody rang out again, this time even more sorrowful. Rachel shakily placed her hands on the keys, wanting to try to play a note. But as her fingers touched them, a cold air rushed through her. The figure of Evelyn Gray appeared right in front of Rachel, faint but clear. Evelyn looked at Rachel with deep, sorrowful eyes. "Who are you?" Rachel asked, her voice trembling. "I'm Evelyn. This is my music. No one else is allowed to play it." Rachel backed away, but Evelyn continued, "Music is my soul. They took it from me, and I can never rest in peace." Rachel realized that Evelyn was not an enemy, but a lost soul, bound to the instrument. "How can I help you?" Rachel asked. Evelyn pointed to a sheet of music on the instrument, the last piece she had never finished. "Play it, complete my music." Rachel sat down in front of the instrument. Her hands were shaking, but she began to play the notes on the old sheet music. The sound resonated, blending with Evelyn's whispers. When the music ended, Evelyn's figure faded away, along with a relieved smile on her face. The instrument never played again. The abandoned house fell silent, as if Evelyn had finally been freed. Rachel returns to the village, bringing with her a tale of a spirit bound by her music. Story 13. Mysterious Stranger. In the small town of Ashwood, where everyone knows each other, the appearance of a stranger is always a topic of discussion. But there is a stranger who comes and leaves mysteriously, leaving behind unanswered questions, and a haunting. One autumn evening, as night falls, Lily, the owner of the small coffee shop in the town, is preparing to close. She is cleaning the tables and chairs when the doorbell rings. A man walks in. He is tall, wearing a long black coat, and a hat that covers most of his face. Only his strangely bright eyes stand out, staring deeply at Lily. "Hello, how can I help you?" Lily asked, trying to keep her voice calm despite feeling something was wrong. The man smiled faintly, a smile that made her shiver. "A cup of coffee, if you don't mind," he said, his voice low and cold. Lily made the coffee and set it on the counter. When she looked up, the man was still watching her intently, as if trying to read her mind. "Are you a passerby?" she asked, trying to break the silence. "You could say so," he replied, and took a sip of his coffee. "This town seems peaceful." "Yes, it's very quiet," Lily replied, but her heart began to beat faster. The man said nothing more. He sat still, staring out the window, as if waiting for something. About 15 minutes later, Lily looked up to ask if he needed anything else, but the man was gone. The full cup of coffee was still on the table, and the shop door was still closed. How did he get out? Lily wondered, a chill running down her spine. She went outside to investigate, but the street was deserted. The wind blew, rustling the dry leaves under her feet. Lily went back inside, telling herself that perhaps she was imagining things. But when she went to clear her coffee cup, she noticed something strange. The cup was no longer hot, but ice cold. The next morning, Lily told the story to a few friends. They just laughed and said that she must have been overworking herself. But an old man in town, Mr. Graham, listened with a serious look. "Describe him to me," Mr. Graham demanded. Lily recounted every detail: the black coat, the bright eyes, the deep, cold voice. Mr. Graham paled. "That stranger. I think I know who he is." According to Mr. Graham, there had been such a man in Ashwood 50 years ago. He didn't stay long, just going from house to house, talking to a few people, then disappearing without a trace. Soon after he left, strange things happened to everyone he came into contact with, and some even disappeared. "It's just a rumor, right?" Lily asked, her voice filled with worry. "No one knows for sure," Mr. Graham said. "But you better be careful." That evening, as Lily was about to close up shop, she heard the doorbell ring again. She turned around, her heart stopping. The stranger was there again, his eyes shining in the dim light. "Thanks for the coffee last night," he said, his voice sounding like it was coming from afar. "Who are you?" Lily asked, trembling, taking a few steps back. The man just smiled, not answering. He turned and walked out the door. When Lily ran out to look, he had disappeared, as if melting into thin air. The next morning, on the coffee table where the man had sat, Lily found a small piece of paper. On it was a single handwritten line. "Sometimes, peace needs a warning." The story of the mysterious stranger quickly spread throughout the town, but no one saw him again. Lily still kept the piece of paper, as a reminder of that strange night. But every time the doorbell rang late at night, she couldn't help but feel that he could return at any moment. Story 14. The creaking door. The house number 22, on Maplewood Street, was old and dilapidated. No one knew who its first owner was, only that it had been abandoned for a long time. However, what made this house become the haunt of the whole neighborhood was not its dilapidated appearance, but its main door. Every night, regardless of whether it was calm or windy, people could hear the creaking sound of the old wooden door, ringing regularly like an eerie refrain. People said that it was an echo of the past, of things that no one dared to mention. Emma was a young college student who had just moved to Maplewood to live with her Aunt Clara. From the very first day, she had heard people talk about house number 22 and the haunted door. But Emma, with her curious personality, did not believe in those stories. A creaking door? It's probably just the wind, she said, half smiling, half sarcastically, when Aunt Clara warned her. Emma, you'd better not go near that house, Aunt Clara said, her eyes full of concern. There are things that should not be disturbed. But that first night, Emma had heard the sound, creak, creak. The sound echoed in the quiet night, steady and clear, as if a door were opening and closing. Emma stood by the window, looking toward number 22. In the dim light of the street lamp, the old wooden door was indeed moving, even though no one was there. She shivered, but couldn't help but be curious. The next day, Emma decided to approach the house. The front door was still ajar, the paint peeling to reveal the old wood underneath. The air around it was strangely cold, even though the sun was shining. Emma touched the door, pushing it gently. It opened without making any sound. Inside was a dark, dusty space. The old furniture was covered in a thick layer of cobwebs. Everything seemed to have stopped in a distant time. But what caught Emma's attention the most was a painting hanging on the living room wall. In the painting was a family of 4, a man, a woman, and 2 children. All were dressed in classical clothes, and their faces carried an indescribable sadness. As Emma approached the painting, the main door behind her slammed shut. Emma was startled, and turned to look. She ran to the door, trying to open it but couldn't. Suddenly, the creaking sound rang out again, this time not from the door but from the stairs leading to the second floor. "Is anyone there?" Emma called out, but only silence answered. She gathered her courage and walked up the stairs. Each step she took made the wooden boards creak, adding to the steady creaking sound. On the second floor, she found a room with a door ajar. A creaking sound came from inside. Emma stepped inside, the light from the window revealing an old rocking chair that was moving, even though no one was sitting there. What the hell? Emma backed away, a cold feeling running down her spine. Suddenly, from the corner of the room, a faint voice rang out, "Are you here to take us away?" Emma turned around, seeing the faint silhouette of a woman standing next to 2 children. Their faces were identical to the people in the painting. "We've been waiting for so long. Help us." Emma didn't know how she was going to escape the house. When she woke up, she found herself lying on the sidewalk, in front of the closed front door of house number 22. The next day, when telling the story to Aunt Clara, Emma realized that the painting she saw in the house was the image of the Parker family, the people who used to live in that house. They were said to have disappeared without a trace 50 years ago. Since then, Emma has never dared to go near house number 22 again. But every night, the creaking sound of the door still echoes, as a reminder that those souls are still waiting for someone to help them rest in peace. Story 15. The Last Letter. In the small town of Everdale, where everyone knows every corner, there is a strange story about a letter that no one can explain. It was sent by a deceased person, carrying a final message, and leaving a haunting impression on the recipient. Clara is a young girl who lost her mother a few weeks ago. Clara's mother Margaret is a kind woman, but since her husband died, she has lived with a lingering sadness. Before she passed away, she left behind only a simple will and a few souvenirs. Clara feels lost because there is no message from her mother, who she always thought would have a lot to say. Late one afternoon, as Clara was cleaning out her mother's old desk, she heard the doorbell ring. The postman was there with an ivory-colored envelope, addressed in a familiar handwriting. "Miss Clara Dawson?" the postman asked. "Yes," Clara replied, taking the envelope. But when she looked at the sender, her blood ran cold. "Margaret Dawson." "That can't be," Clara muttered. The postman shrugged. "It was sent 3 weeks ago, my dear. The day she died." Clara closed the door, her heart abuzz with emotion. She opened the envelope, and inside was a letter in familiar, neat handwriting. "Dear Clara, by the time you read this, I will probably be dead. But there is something I need you to know, a secret I have kept for too long. Go to the bottom drawer of my bedroom, and you will understand. I love you, more than anything in the world. Your mother, Margaret." Clara trembled, reading the letter over and over again. The handwriting was clearly her mother's, unmistakable. But how could she have sent it after she was dead? Unable to wait any longer, Clara rushed to her mother's bedroom. The bottom drawer was locked, but she found the key in her mother's old jewelry box. When she opened it, she found a diary and a small wooden box. Inside the diary were lines of anguish. Her mother told her about years of living in torment because of a mistake in the past, a secret related to her father's death. "Clara, your father did not die in an accident like I said. It was my fault. We had an argument that day, and I let him go in a fit of rage. When I found out he had been in an accident on the road, I didn't have time to say I was sorry." Clara choked up, tears streaming down her cheeks. She couldn't believe that her mother had lived with that pain for so many years. In the wooden box, she found an old family photo and her father's wedding ring. On the back of the photo was a scribbled note from her mother, "Please forgive me." Clara held the ring in her hand, feeling a cold air run through her. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered, and she heard a soft whisper, "Thank you, Clara." She stood still, her heart pounding. That voice was her mother's, warm and familiar. The last letter was not just a message, but also a way for her mother to make amends, to rest in peace. From then on, Clara felt more relieved. She kept the ring and the photo with her, as a reminder of her mother's never-fading love. But every time she saw the ivory envelope, she couldn't help but wonder, was it really her mother who sent it from the other world? Story 16. The Silent Cry. In the small village of Willowvale, there is a strange story that has been passed down through the generations about a house by the lake. The house once belonged to the Blackwood family, but after a heartbreaking tragedy, the place was abandoned for decades. Every night, people say they can see the shadow of a woman sitting by the window, and although she makes no sound, everyone can feel her silent crying. Lila, a young journalist, comes to Willowvale to find inspiration for a new article. She hears about the story of the Blackwood house from a local while sitting in a small cafe in the village. They say she's still there, crying every night. The old man tells the story, his eyes sad. But you won't hear her crying. You'll just feel it, like a wave in the air. "Who is she?" Lila asked, her eyes shining with curiosity. "Elizabeth Blackwood," the old man said. "Her husband disappeared on the lake one stormy night, and she never got over the grief. One day, she was seen sitting by the window, looking out at the lake, and she never left again." Lila decided to go to the house to find out. That afternoon, as dusk began to tint the lake with gold, she headed to the Blackwood house. The house looked as if it had been frozen in time. The wooden walls were rotten, the roof was sagging, but the windows above were still intact, like eyes watching the calm lake. Lila opened the door and entered. Inside, everything was covered in dust and cobwebs, but the old furniture was still in place. A painting hung on the wall, depicting a young woman with sad eyes. It must have been Elizabeth. Lila sensed a strange atmosphere. There was no sound, but she felt as if she were entering a space filled with pain. Darkness fell, and Lila decided to stay in the house, despite the warnings from the villagers. She wanted to see for herself what they called the silent cry. Around midnight, as the moonlight illuminated the lake, Lila heard it, not with her ears, but with her heart. A painful, heartbreaking feeling, as if the sadness of the world was pressing down on her. She looked up, and in the dim light, she saw the silhouette of a woman standing by the window. The figure was slender, her shoulders shaking, but she made no sound. Lila stepped closer, trying not to make a sound. When she reached the foot of the stairs, the figure turned to look at her. Elizabeth's eyes were wet, but the tears never fell. "What do you need here?" Lila asked, her voice choking. Elizabeth did not answer. She just looked at Lila with eyes that seemed to want to say something, then disappeared into thin air. The next morning, Lila left the house, carrying a heavy feeling in her heart. She decided to learn more about Elizabeth and discovered a terrible secret. Elizabeth's husband did not disappear in an accident. He abandoned her to run away with another woman. Elizabeth, betrayed and lost, spent her whole life waiting for her husband who never returned. She died alone, but her soul was still there, living with unspeakable pain. Lila wrote her story, not forgetting to mention the lesson of loneliness and unending pain. But deep down, she knew one thing: no matter how much she wrote, she would never forget the feeling of Elizabeth's silent cry. Backhand index pointing right. Can you feel the pain of this soundless cry? Story 17. The Shadow on the Wall. Number 15. Havenwood Street is a house with an old-fashioned architecture and smooth, creamy white walls. It was the ideal home for the young couple Sarah and James when they first moved in. However, they quickly realized that there was something unusual about this house. It all started one evening, when Sarah was cleaning the living room. She noticed a strange shadow on the wall opposite the window. The shadow was not hers or James's, because they were both on the same side of the room. "James, look!" Sarah called out. James walked in, staring at the wall. "It could be the shadow of a piece of furniture or something outside," he said, trying to stay calm. But Sarah shook her head. "It can't be. Look, it doesn't change, no matter where we stand or how the light in the room changes." That night, they lay in bed, but Sarah couldn't sleep. She had the feeling that someone was watching her. When she turned to look at the bedroom door, she saw the shadow again. This time, it wasn't on the living room wall anymore, but had moved to the hallway outside the bedroom. "James, it's there again," Sarah whispered, waking her husband. James sat up, turned on his flashlight, and shone it into the hallway. But there was nothing there. "You must have imagined it," he said, but his voice was laced with worry. The next day, Sarah decided to find out more about the house. She stopped by the local library, where an elderly staff member told her that number 15 had once belonged to a man named Harold. Harold lived alone and was haunted by the idea that something was watching him. He often told his neighbors about a shapeless shadow he saw on his wall. No one believed him, and Harold died alone. "You mean that darkness in your house?" the clerk asked, eyes worried. Sarah nodded. Is there any way to make it go away? Nobody knows. But maybe it's more than just a shadow. That night, Sarah and James decided to face the darkness. They sat in the living room, the dim light of the table lamp casting a shadow on the wall. And then, there was again, a faint but unmistakable shadow, a patchy blackness unlike anything else in the house. We need to do something, Sarah said, her voice trembling. James moved closer to the wall, touching the darkness. But as he did, a cold chill ran through him. He stepped back, gasping. It's not just a shadow. It's alive, James said, his face pale. Sarah remembered the librarian's words. Maybe this darkness was more than just a physical phenomenon. She found Harold's old diary, which was kept in the library, and read the last thing he had written before he died. The darkness is not just something I see, it is a part of me. It grows, gets stronger, as if it is sucking the life out of me. Who will be next? Sarah shuddered as she read this. James, I think it is what imprisoned Harold all his life. And now, it is trying to do the same to us. James nodded. We can't let it go on. Something has to be done. The two decided to destroy the wall where the darkness had appeared. They stripped away the paint, the bricks, and dug deeper. When they broke through the last layer of wood, they discovered a small niche containing an old metal box. Inside was an old photograph of Harold and a scrawled note. I made a mistake. Help me free myself. As soon as they took the box away from the wall, the shadow on the wall began to dissipate. But before it disappeared completely, it shrank into the shape of a man, looking straight at them with a pained gaze. Then it was gone. From then on, number 15 became quiet. Sarah and James never saw the shadow again, but they knew it was more than just a strange phenomenon. It was the mark of a trapped soul, finally freed. Story 18. The Ever-Burning Candle. In a small village deep in the Fogmore Valley, there is a strange legend about a candle that never goes out. The villagers say it was found in the old church on the hill, where time seems to have stopped. The candle burns forever, as if it does not belong to this world. Anna is a young girl who loves to explore mysteries. When she hears the story of the candle, she immediately wants to find out the truth. The villagers warn her, saying that anyone who touches the candle will encounter strange things. But Anna does not believe in superstitions. It is just a candle. How can it be dangerous? She says to the old man selling goods in the village. It is not the candle, but what keeps it burning, the old man replies, his eyes full of mystery. That afternoon, Anna goes up to the church on the hill. It was an ancient building, with a rotten tiled roof and moss-covered walls. The large wooden door was slightly open, revealing an eerily quiet interior. Anna stepped inside, the dim light from the stained glass windows on the walls shining on the cold stone floor. In the center of the church, on a stone pedestal, she saw a candle burning forever. The flame was small, golden, but burned strangely brightly. There was no sign of it dying down, though the candle seemed to have burned out almost completely. Anna moved closer, feeling as if the flame was calling to her. She raised her hand to touch the candle, but just as her fingers were a few centimeters away, a cold air swept over her. "Don't touch," a weak voice called out from behind her. Anna turned around, but saw no one. Curious, she picked up the candle. As soon as she did, a strange feeling enveloped the space. Whispers began to rise all around her, like dozens of people talking at once. "What have you done?" an old voice called out. Anna turned around, startled, to see an old man standing at the entrance to the church. He was dressed in a black cloak, his deep eyes filled with worry. "I just wanted to take a look," Anna stammered. "That candle isn't for you," he said. "It's a curse, a link between this world and the next. Whoever touches it will awaken what shouldn't be awakened." Before Anna could react, the candle in her hand began to burn more intensely. The flame suddenly turned a cold blue, emitting an eerie glow. Shadowy figures began to appear in the air, surrounding her. "You have to put it back on the pedestal," the man shouted. Anna panicked, trying to put the candle back where it belonged, but the flames seemed to be resisting her. She felt as if dozens of invisible hands were pulling her, holding the candle tightly in her hand. "Let it go," the old man's voice became more urgent. With all her strength, Anna threw the candle towards the stone pedestal. The candle fell and settled on the pedestal, the flame returning to its original golden color. The shadows disappeared, and the church space became silent as if nothing had ever happened. The old man stepped closer to her, his eyes softening. "You are lucky. Not everyone can survive after awakening the candle." Anna gasped, looking at the candle with fear. "Why does it exist?" "It is the curse of a priest who betrayed the church centuries ago. The candle holds his soul, not allowing him to rest. And anyone who touches it will suffer the wrath of the souls imprisoned with him." Anna shivered, the cold still clinging to her. From that day on, Anna never returned to the church on the hill. But every time she saw the light of the candle in the night, she could not forget the feeling of the shadows, of the fire that never went out, and of the secrets that this world was not ready to face. Story 19. The Ghost Mirror. The Whitaker family home in the small town of Ravenswood is known for its quaint charm. But in that house, there is a large mirror hanging on the living room wall that no one dares to approach. The townspeople say that the mirror can reflect the images of the dead, and anyone who sees the image will encounter terrifying things. When Emma, a college student who loves paranormal stories, hears about the mirror, she is immediately attracted. One day, she decides to visit the Whitaker house, which is now abandoned. Despite warnings from the locals, Emma believes that the stories are just made up to scare the curious. "It's just a mirror," she tells herself as she stands in front of the house's large wooden door. The door creaks open, revealing a dark and cold space. Dust covered the furniture, and the light from the dirty windows was just enough to see the way. Emma entered, flashlight in hand, and made her way to the living room. There, a giant mirror hung on the wall. The frame was intricately carved, but the reflective glass had a dull tint, as if it were hiding something. Emma moved closer, feeling as if the mirror was inviting her. She looked at her reflection in the mirror, but something was wrong. Her reflection didn't move in sync. When she tilted her head, the image in the mirror didn't change immediately, but delayed by a few seconds. It must be an old mirror, Emma reassured herself, but her heart began to beat faster. She raised her hand to touch the mirror. As her fingers touched the cold surface, a cold chill ran through her body. Suddenly, the image in the mirror changed. Her reflection disappeared, replaced by the image of a strange woman. The woman had sunken eyes, a pale face, and wore a vintage dress from the last century. "Who are you?" Emma stepped back, her voice trembling. The woman in the mirror didn't answer. She just stared at Emma, then slowly raised her hand, pointing behind her. Emma turned, but there was nothing. When she looked back at the mirror, the woman was gone, replaced by the image of a man, his face full of hatred and his eyes burning with reproach. Emma panicked, running out of the living room. But wherever she went in the house, she kept seeing strange images in the smaller mirrors on the wall. Another image appeared, this time of a little girl with long hair and sad eyes. "You have to help us," the voice whispered, soft but dark. Emma screamed, running to the door. But the wooden door was now locked. She was trapped, and the whispering from the large mirror grew louder, as if the trapped spirits were trying to say something. She turned back to the living room, and this time the mirror no longer reflected her. Instead, she saw dozens of figures, crowded together, knocking on the glass as if trying to break free. "Free us!" came the unanimous cry, shrill and painful. Emma picked up a chair and threw it straight at the mirror. The glass shattered, and the screams of the spirits filled the air. Everything fell silent after that. The house seemed to return to normal, but Emma knew that she never wanted to return to this place again. When she left, a small piece of glass from the mirror fell into her pocket. And that night, when she returned home, she saw a reflection of a person in that small piece of glass, haunting eyes staring straight at her. Story 20. The Dark Passage. On the outskirts of the town of Shadowridge, there is a narrow path that cuts through the old forest, known to the locals as the Dark Passage. The path is so densely covered with trees that sunlight rarely penetrates it. But what makes this path a creepy legend is not just its darkness, but the terrifying secrets buried at the end of the path. It is rumored that anyone who walks through this path after sunset will never return. Curious people, daring explorers, all have disappeared without a trace. Ethan, a young reporter who specializes in mystery stories, does not believe in rumors. When he hears about the Dark Passage, he decides to explore it himself and unravel the secret of this path. "I will show everyone that this is just the imagination of the villagers," he tells his girlfriend, Chloe, as he packs his bags. Chloe, worried by Ethan's decision, tried to convince him to leave. "There are places that should not be disturbed. Ethan, don't go." But Ethan didn't listen. With his camera, flashlight, and notebook, he entered the path as dusk began to fall. The path greeted Ethan with an odd chill. Though it was still light outside, the light inside the path seemed dimmer. The branches of the trees stretched out like skinny hands, and the rustling of leaves in the wind sounded like whispers. Ethan held his flashlight tightly, shining it ahead. The path narrowed, the bushes growing closer together, as if to block his path. As he walked further, a heavy feeling crept into the air. His own footsteps echoed on the ground, but every now and then, he heard other footsteps, soft, quiet, as if someone were following him. "It's just my imagination," Ethan told himself, but cold sweat had already begun to form on his forehead. As night fell completely, the path became pitch black. The light from Ethan's flashlight seemed to be swallowed by the surrounding darkness. Suddenly, he saw a small house appear at the end of the road. The house looked old, with a dilapidated tiled roof and broken windows. But the dim light coming from inside made Ethan curious. He approached, the wooden door creaking open when he pushed it gently. Inside, the house was empty, but in the middle of the room was a deep hole, covered by a rotten wooden board. Ethan felt a cold air coming from the hole. He bent down, shining his flashlight into it, but could not see the bottom. From deep within the hole, a whisper rang out, soft but menacing. "Come down here, with us." Ethan backed away, his heart pounding. The whispering grew louder, mixed with wild laughter and painful screams. Ethan turned and ran out of the house, but the path was no longer the same. Thick bushes had grown in, blocking any escape. "What's going on?" Ethan shouted, but only his own echo answered. From the darkness, shadowy figures began to appear. They moved between the trees, eyes glowing, staring at Ethan. "You shouldn't have come here," a deep voice said. Ethan turned, and a tall, pale man stood before him. "This is where we belong. And now, so do you." Ethan disappeared that night. No trace of him was ever found, except for the camera left at the entrance to the path. When his girlfriend, Chloe, reviewed the photos on her camera, she saw pictures of the path, the house, and the hole. But the last photo made her shiver. It was Ethan, but he was no longer himself. His face was distorted, his eyes were dark, and he had a strange smile. Since then, no one dared to enter the dark passage again. Story 21. The Frozen Lake. In the cold northern mountains, there is a lake called Silent Lake, where the surface of the lake is always frozen, no matter the season. The locals avoid this lake, not because of the extreme cold, but because of a creepy legend. Under the ice, there are souls trapped, waiting for a chance to escape. Claire, a climate researcher, came to this mountain to study the strange phenomenon of Silent Lake. She was fascinated by the story of the ice that never melted and wanted to find out the real reason behind it. People in the nearby village warned her. "That lake is more than just ice," said an old man. "It is where cursed souls are buried. Don't risk it." But Claire didn't believe in ghost stories. "Science can explain everything," she told herself as she got on her sled and headed towards the lake. Lake Tranquility came into view, white and eerily quiet. The lake reflected the gray sky, and the surrounding space was so cold that Claire could feel her breath freeze. She stepped into the middle of the lake, setting up the temperature measuring equipment and taking ice samples. As she plunged the drill into the thick ice, a strange sound rang out. Crack, crack. Claire stopped, looking around. But there was nothing but cold wind blowing across the lake. She continued her work, but a feeling of unease began to creep into her mind. Suddenly, under the transparent ice, she saw a figure. Claire bent down, her eyes wide with surprise. It was a woman, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear, as if staring straight at her from beneath the ice. "This can't be," Claire muttered, but when she reached out to touch the ice, the image disappeared. She convinced herself it was an illusion, but a whisper rang through the air, "Help us out." Claire jumped to her feet, looking around. "Who's there?" she shouted, but only her own echo answered. The lake began to shake. Tiny cracks appeared, spreading out into a network like sharp spikes. Under the ice, Claire saw more figures, dozens, hundreds of pale faces, empty eyes staring at her. She backed away, but the lake beneath her feet suddenly became thinner. The ice cracked, and she fell into the freezing water. Claire struggled, trying to cling to the edge, but invisible hands from beneath the water held her tight. "Stay with us," the voice said, now no longer a whisper but a mournful chorus. The next morning, the villagers found Claire's sled near the shore. But she was never found. When a rescue team drilled deep into the ice to search, they discovered a horrifying thing. Under the thick ice, hundreds of bodies lay piled on top of each other, frozen in painful positions. But strangely, all of their eyes were wide open, as if staring straight at the surface. Since then, no one dared to go near the Lake of Tranquility. But on cold nights, people say they can still hear whispers from the lake, inviting curious souls to join the trapped souls. Story 22. A Face in the Dark. The Bennett family home is located on the outskirts of the city, a quiet and cozy place. But ever since they moved in, Amelia, the 17-year-old daughter, began to feel something strange. Every night, when the lights were off, she felt like there were eyes watching her from the dark corner of her bedroom. One night, while Amelia was reading by the nightlight, she heard a small noise coming from the corner of the room. Crack, crack. She looked up, looked in that direction, but saw only thick darkness. An uneasy feeling crept into her mind, but she told herself that maybe she was just imagining it. But then, as soon as she turned off the lights and lay down, from that dark corner, she saw a face. It was not a normal human face, it was pale, its eyes were deep like two black holes, and its smile was twisted and evil. Amelia jumped up and turned on the light, but the face was gone, leaving only an empty corner. The next morning, Amelia told her mother, but she just laughed. "You must have been dreaming, Amelia. This is a new house, there is nothing to be afraid of." But Amelia wasn't sure. That night, she left the light on all night, but she still felt the eyes watching her. A few days later, Amelia decided to tell her best friend, Lucy. The two of them decided to explore whether the dark corner of Amelia's room really contained something. Lucy brought a flashlight and a camera. "If there is something, we will see it," she said, trying to be brave. When night fell, the two of them sat in the room with all the lights off. The corner was completely dark. Amelia could feel the air in the room becoming colder than usual. "Look!" Lucy exclaimed, pointing at the camera screen. In the darkness, through the lens, the face Amelia had seen before appeared again. This time, it wasn't just standing still, its lips were moving, as if whispering something. Lucy hurriedly turned on the light, but the face was gone. The next day, Amelia and Lucy searched for information about the house. They discovered that it had previously belonged to a man named Harold, who lived alone and was haunted by the darkness. He believed that there was something watching him in the darkness and had taken his own life in the bedroom Amelia was in. "Maybe his spirit is still there," Lucy said. Amelia felt a chill at the thought. The next night, Amelia decided to face her fear. She sat alone in her room, the lights completely off, and stared into the dark corner. She whispered, "If you are here, tell me what you want." The dark corner was silent for a few seconds, but then the face appeared again, clearer than ever. "You must go," the voice hissed, cold and menacing. Amelia turned on the light, but this time the face did not disappear. It gradually became clearer, and the body of a man appeared. Amelia screamed, rushing out of the room. The Bennett family left the house the next day. The new owners were unaware of the story, but the legend of the face in the dark continues to haunt those who dare to enter that room. Backhand index pointing right. Do you dare to look into the dark corner of your room tonight? If the story makes you shiver, share it with your friends and leave your thoughts below. Don't forget to follow to discover more mysterious stories. Story 23. The Last Goodbye. Sarah was sitting in the living room, scrolling through her phone as usual. That afternoon was quiet, until she received a text message from her mother's phone number. "Sarah, I love you. Don't forget to live well." Sarah froze. The phone in her hand felt heavy. The strangest and most horrifying thing was that her mother had passed away 3 days ago. Sarah tried to calm herself down and told herself that it was just a cruel joke. But when she checked again, the phone number was indeed her mother's. "This can't be," she muttered, her heart pounding. She decided to text back. "Mom? Is that you? Who's using this phone?" The message was quickly sent, but there was no reply. Sarah sat waiting, her eyes glued to the screen. A feeling of unease crept into her every second. That night, Sarah told her brother, David, about this. "Someone must have gotten her number," David said, trying to make sense. "Or maybe it's a system error." Sarah nodded, but her heart was still pounding. She decided to call her mother's number, but the phone just rang and no one answered. That night, Sarah couldn't sleep. She lay in bed, eyes wide open, staring at the ceiling. The clock read 3 a.m., and suddenly, her phone lit up. Another text message from her mother's number. "I'm fine, Sarah. Don't worry. Keep going." This time, the message made Sarah feel warm, but also dark. As if her mother was really trying to say goodbye. The next morning, Sarah decided to dig deeper. She called her carrier to check the number. But when they looked it up, they said the number had been deactivated the day her mother died. "That can't be!" Sarah screamed. The employee was silent, then said in a confused voice, "I don't know how to explain it, but the system has no record of any messages sent from this number." Sarah returned home, feeling as if the world around her had become even stranger. That night, she received a final text message from her mother's number. "Stop looking, Sarah. Remember that I am always with you. This is the last time. I love you." After that text message, the phone number disappeared from her contacts completely, as if it had never existed. Sarah never received another text message from her mother. But she knew that, although she couldn't explain it, her mother had found a way to send her a final goodbye, so that she could move on without any more regrets. Story 24. Whisper of Death. The small town of Windvale, nestled in the Green Hills, has always been peaceful and quiet. But the elders of the town often warn the younger generation of a mysterious whisper, a silent but deadly whisper that leads the unwary into the hands of death. Jenny, an 18-year-old girl, has never believed in those stories. To her, they are just threats to keep the people of the town docile. But everything changes one night, when she is walking through the fields near her house. The wind blows gently through the tall grass, and Jenny feels that there is something different in the air. As she turns to go back, a whisper passes by, as light and vague as the wind. "Jenny, come here." She stops, startled. There is no one around. "It's just my imagination," Jenny tells herself, and walks on. But the whispering sounded again, this time clearer, as if coming from ahead. "Come here, Jenny." Despite her panic, Jenny felt an invisible force pulling her to follow the call. She walked slowly across the field, towards a large old tree, where the thick darkness obscured everything. As she approached the tree, she saw a faint figure standing there, a tall man, his face covered in darkness. "You're here," a low voice rang out. "Who are you? Why did you call me?" Jenny asked, trembling, but her legs couldn't move to turn away. The man chuckled, a cold laugh that made Jenny feel her heart freeze. "I only show the way. As for your fate, it's yours." Jenny suddenly fell to the ground, feeling everything around her spinning. When she opened her eyes, she found herself no longer in the field. Before her was a terrifying sight, a ruined house, with shadowy figures screaming silently inside. Where's this?" Jenny shouted, but only an echo answered her. The man stepped closer, his face now visible. It was not a person, his eyes were deep and empty, and his skin was as pale as mist. "I am your guide. And now, you must choose." "Which?" Jenny stammered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Go forward, or turn back. But remember, every step carries a price." Jenny decided to turn and run. She ran through the dark shadows, the whispers growing louder, like hundreds of voices calling her name. When the last light flashed, she found herself lying in a field, a few meters from the ancient tree. Her heart was pounding, and she did not dare look back. The next day, Jenny told the story to her friends, but no one believed her. However, the elders in the village only looked at her with worried eyes. "You heard the whisper," said an old man. "But you were lucky to come back in time. Not everyone can do that." From then on, Jenny stayed away from the field, but every night, she still heard a faint whisper from the old tree. That whisper was like a reminder that death was always waiting, and with just one wrong step, she would never return. Backhand index pointing right. Do you dare to follow a mysterious whisper in the night? If the story makes you shiver, share it with your friends and leave your feelings below. Don't forget to follow to discover more mysterious stories.